From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. The other piece of Supreme Court news that is roiling the legal world is an allegation that Justice Samuel Alito leaked the outcome of a case in 2014. But Alicia, reading this story, and it seems mostly based on this story in the New York Times, it is remarkable to me how thin the allegation is. Former pro-life pastor named Rob Schenck says that he heard from a woman in 2014 that the woman had had dinner with Justice Alito and that Justice Alito had revealed the outcome of this case, which was supposed to come down in about 3 weeks. But the woman denies that this happened. Justice Alito denies that this happened. And so what really is the allegation here? I mean, we have Senator Sheldon Whitehouse vowing that he's going to investigate, but it seems like a pretty thin read to me.
Right. Actually, Politico reported that they had actually heard in the same allegation or got, quote unquote, tipped off. And they had spent months trying to find and confirm another source who had heard the same thing, and they couldn't. And so they didn't report it. So it also just demonstrates the erosion of journalistic standards that the New York Times decided to go ahead with this. Obviously, it has some kind of political news value, allows that advance the narrative that the Supreme Court is somehow tainted and it is suffering from ethics problems, and therefore Congress or the Democrats want to exercise more oversight of it, as well as they want more ground or justification to potentially pack the Supreme Court with more liberal justices. But they also want to just intimidate the justices in these cases that are being heard this term, especially the affirmative action case, the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, which is a paramount case that will get a ruling next June because it is probably the most important case that the court is hearing, along with there's another voting rights case on racial redistricting, as well as one involving electors or state Supreme Court's ability to override state legislatures, redistricting maps, as well as other election laws, which will also be important. But the goal of the left here is basically just to bully the conservative justices around and say, hey, see, this is what you're going to get if you rule against us. So this is, in my view, is just an intimidation campaign in an effort to smear the court and undermine its credibility with the public.
One point I would make, though, is some of the coverage is comparing this to the leak of Justice Alito's draft opinion in the Dobbs abortion case and framing it as reports of another leak at the Supreme Court. And I guess I take issue with that because the Dobbs leak, which was, remember, an unprecedented leak of the entirety of a draft opinion from the court, seemed like it was intended. This happened 2 months before the ruling ultimately came down. Seemed like it was intended to influence the court's operation. And Kate, to me, I mean, even if you assume that some justice a couple weeks before an opinion came down in a social setting with a friend was a little less discreet than they ought to have been, to me, there's no comparison between these things.
Well, Kyle, the timing here is obviously suspect. This is a case that was now 8 years ago, and I don't think anyone can seriously argue that we would be hearing about this had Dobbs gone the other way. So I think you have to look at the underlying motivations of the source here, and I think they're rather obvious. And the letter that this pastor sent to Chief Justice Roberts was basically saying, well, just thought you should know since the Dobbs draft leak. So again, I think there's some suspect motivations here. And again, just to underscore how thin the charges are, remember this pastor making this claim was not even at the dinner with the Alitos. He's potentially hearing it from somebody who denies it, who had dinner with them. So it's so far removed from the actual horse's mouth. It's really a game of telephone. And so I just think it's basically, Alicia, I think got at this well, it's really just part of the larger effort to basically, as I think we wrote in our editorial today, have some reason why every one of the conservative justices is not legitimate. You know, I mean, Neil Gorsuch, he wouldn't wear a mask. There were some stories about that, or that he talked too much when he first got on the court. Amy Barrett has been portrayed as a religious zealot so many times, a handmaid. We have Clarence Thomas and his wife, because his wife was involved in politics and believed claims about the 2020 election that weren't true. And so this is just a continuation of that campaign, I think, to make the court look illegitimate. And the design there, the goal of that, I don't think is hard to discern, which is, I think most progressives would like to pack the court. They'd like to put more justices on and not have the current number that we have. And so I think that if you over time make everybody look as though they are illegitimate, that becomes much easier. So I think you have to view this episode as part of that larger campaign.
The final point I would make is that I understand the conventions around the Supreme Court and the secrecy of its deliberations, and I understand why those are there. But justices are humans, and they misspeak sometimes, they speak out of turn sometimes. But it does seem to me that there is a differential in the way these things are treated, and I would point to some comments made by the late Justice Ginsburg. She, not in a private setting, not in a social setting, to a friend, she was speaking to a reporter at the New York Times in 2016. She said, "I can't imagine what the country would be with Donald Trump as our president." She said she and her husband used to joke about moving to New Zealand. She told CNN, "How has he gotten away with not turning over his tax returns? The press seems to be very gentle with him on that." And yesterday, here's the headline, "Supreme Court clears way for Trump tax returns to go to Congress." So it is not hard to imagine how that could have been at least an argument made to the Supreme Court that Justice Ginsburg, if she were still on the court, had a conflict of interest in that case. She also told the New York Times, related to a previous affirmative action case, Justice Elena Kagan had recused, but Justice Ginsburg said if Justice Kagan had been there, it would have been 5-3. That's about as solid as you can get. So apparently, disclosing Justice Kagan's view of that case that she had recused from. And Alicia, I do not recall, a huge outcry at the comments that Justice Ginsburg made.
No, these comments, they made a lot of big news at the time, and they were cheered by the left, in part because they reflected their own views about these issues. But even recently, Justice Kagan has kind of taken swipes at the court, suggesting that it's losing its credibility, that's becoming political. Justice Sotomayor had also taken a swipe at Clarence Thomas by saying, not everyone can bring themselves up or can even reach their bootstraps, which was kind of a dig at his conservative views. And so the court, interestingly, Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia had a great relationship, and there was a lot of comity on the court. And the concern now is that the political atmosphere and environment might undermine that comity, especially with these justices now speaking out more freely, feeling that they are there, especially the liberal justices. You're not really hearing so much about this for the conservative justices as they try to, participate in this liberal campaign to intimidate the majority. Especially Chief Justice Roberts, who really does want to protect the integrity and the image of the independence of the Supreme Court and the judiciary. And I think this is all just part of that campaign to steer him and perhaps, Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, who've also shown themselves to be somewhat amenable to some of these attacks.
Thank you, Alicia and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button. Have a happy Thanksgiving to one and all, and we'll be back Friday with another edition of Potomac Watch.